What if I told you the Vikings didn't conquer the North Atlantic with swords, but with calories? Before ships, raids, and sagas, survival came first. Viking expansion was powered by food systems engineered for cold, darkness, distance, and brutal labor. This is not a romantic feast of overflowing horns and endless meat. It is a hard, efficient cuisine built to keep bodies alive when crops failed, seas froze, and journeys stretched for months. Below are 10 core Viking foods, not recipes, but survival technologies. Each dish reveals how Norse people endured scarcity, crossed oceans, and outlasted rivals. Written for a modern American audience, this is the food history they don't teach in school. If there was one food that truly built Viking society, it wasn't meat, ale, or feast day abundance. It was barley porridge. Barley was the grain that survived where others failed. In the thin, stony soils of Scandinavia under short summers and unpredictable weather, wheat was a gamble. Barley was a guarantee. It grew fast, tolerated cold and poor land, and could be harvested before winter closed in. For Viking families living on the edge of agricultural possibility, barley was not a preference. It was security. The grain was crushed coarsely and boiled in water or milk until it formed a thick, heavy porridge. This was not a side dish. It was eaten morning and night, year after year. Its flavor was simple, often bland, but flavor was never the point. Density was. A single bowl could sustain a farmer through hours of field work, a rower through a freezing sea crossing, or a blacksmith through the heat of the forge. Barley porridge was endlessly adaptable. Thinned with water, it became soup. Cooked longer, it turned into paste. Left to cool, it could be sliced, reheated, or carried. On rare days, salt, herbs, or animal fat might be added, but most of the time, it was plain, honest fuel. To a modern American ear, porridge sounds humble, almost impoverished. To a Viking, it was something far more serious. It was insurance against hunger, insurance against winter, insurance against death. And in a world where survival was never guaranteed, that was worth more than any feast. Soft bread requires ovens, controlled heat, and time. The Viking world had none of those luxuries. Across much of Scandinavia, permanent ovens were rare, expensive, and impractical. Homes were built for warmth and durability, not baking precision. Fire meant survival, not culinary finesse. So the Vikings adapted. They stripped bread down to its most essential form. Flatbread became the answer. Made from barley or rye flour, mixed only with water and sometimes a pinch of salt, the dough was shaped into thin discs and cooked directly on hot stones, iron griddles, or simple hearth plates. There was no yeast, no rising, no softness, just flour, water, and fire. The result was dense, dry, and plain. But it worked. Flatbread dried quickly and resisted mold in damp northern climates. It could be stacked, carried, and stored for long periods without spoiling. Fresh off the fire, it was edible. After days or weeks, it hardened like wood, but it never became useless. Broken into pieces, it could be soaked in broth, softened in stews, or crushed back into porridge. Nothing was wasted. This was bread engineered for movement, for travel, for uncertainty. To modern Americans, bread is about comfort and variety. For the Vikings, bread was about predictability. It meant calories that could be counted on when crops failed, journeys stretched on, or storms delayed a return home. In a world without bakeries, supply chains, or guarantees, flatbread offered something far more valuable than flavor. It meant nourishment anywhere a fire could be lit. One of the most powerful forces in the Viking world was not forged in iron or mined from amber shores. It was pulled from the sea. Dried fish, especially cod, was the quiet engine behind Viking expansion. Along the cold coasts of Scandinavia, fish were split open, cleaned, and hung on wooden racks, exposed to relentless wind and freezing air. Over weeks, sometimes months, moisture vanished. What remained was almost weightless, rock hard, and astonishingly durable. This was the food later known as stockfish. Unlike salted meat, dried fish required no barrels, no imported salt, no constant attention. Nature did the work. Cold preserved it. Wind finished the job. The result could last for years without rotting, molding, or losing its nutritional value. Dried fish was dense with protein and minerals, exactly what the human body needed after days of rowing, sailing, or hauling cargo across hostile seas. It could be eaten raw in emergencies, softened in water, or boiled into stews that stretched supplies and warmed frozen hands. A small bundle could sustain a crew far from land. This food changed geography. It made long-distance voyages possible. It allowed ships to carry sustenance without excessive weight. It fed settlers who arrived in Iceland, Greenland, and other marginal lands where agriculture struggled to take root. Without dried fish, Viking ships might still have sailed, but they would not have stayed. The North Atlantic would not have been settled. Exploration would have ended at the shoreline. The conquest of the sea did not begin with sails or swords. It began with protein that could survive the journey. Fresh meat belonged to summer. Winter did not. For the Vikings, the slaughter season was brief and unforgiving. Animals were killed when the cold arrived, not for celebration, but because feeding them through winter was impossible. What followed was a race against decay. Salt became the difference between survival and hunger. Pork, beef, goat, and mutton were cut into heavy slabs and packed with salt, dried in wind, or hung in smoke. Salt drew moisture from the flesh, slowing rot but at a cost. The meat hardened, darkened, and absorbed salt until it became dense, rigid, and nearly inedible in its raw state. Flavor was sacrificed deliberately. Longevity mattered more. When the time came to eat it, the process was reversed as much as possible. Meat was soaked in cold water, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. It was boiled. The water poured off, then boiled again. Each cycle stripped away a little salt, enough to make the meat tolerable, never pleasant. What remained was tough and bland, but it carried what the body needed most in winter: fat and protein. In months when fields lay frozen, fishing was impossible, and stores ran thin, salted meat became the final reserve. It was rationed carefully, stretched with grains, and eaten without ceremony. This was not the food of feasts or sagas. It did not appear in songs. Salted meat was emergency food. It was winter sealed in a barrel, quiet, brutal, and life-preserving. When everything else failed, it stood between the Viking household and starvation. In the Viking world, smoke was not an accident of poor ventilation. It was a strategy. Smokehouses were not separate buildings standing behind the home. The home itself was the smokehouse. Viking longhouses were deliberately designed to trap smoke from the central hearth, allowing it to drift upward and linger among the rafters. There, strips of meat and fish hung in the dark, day after day, absorbing smoke as they slowly dried. This constant exposure was not about flavor, it was about chemistry. Smoke carried compounds that inhibited bacteria, discouraged insects, and slowed decay in a climate where dampness was relentless and cold alone was not always enough. Over time, the food darkened, toughened, and took on a sharp, bitter intensity that many modern palates would find overwhelming. But to the Vikings, that bitterness was reassurance. Every meal carried the scent of fire. Clothing, hair, and walls absorbed it as well. Smoke was woven into daily life, marking the passage of seasons and the presence of survival. When storms cut off fishing, when winter sealed the land, smoked food remained dependable. It required no barrels, no imported salt, and no complex tools. Only fire, patience, and time. For Viking families, smoke meant protection. It meant food that would still be there tomorrow. And in a world without refrigeration or certainty, that mattered more than taste. To modern minds, smoke is seasoning. To the Vikings, it was safety made visible in the air. Milk does not last. time, warmth, and bacteria destroy it quickly. Fermentation does the opposite. For the Vikings, dairy was not a luxury, it was a system. Cattle, goats, and sheep grazed on grasses that humans could not eat, transforming otherwise useless land into a steady stream of calories. Milk was only the beginning. Left untreated, it spoiled within hours. But handled with knowledge passed down through generations, it became something far more powerful. Vikings turned milk into skyr, sour milk, butter, cheese, and whey through controlled fermentation. Skyr, a thick, tangy cultured dairy, was dense, filling, and far more stable than fresh milk. Butter and cheese concentrated fat, creating precious stores of energy that could be carried into the long winter months. These products aged slowly, resisted spoilage, and traveled far better than liquid milk ever could. Whey, often thrown away today, was anything but waste in the Viking world. It became a daily drink, hydrating, mineral-rich, and lightly fermented. Slightly alcoholic, it was safer than untreated water and easier to store. For many households, whey was consumed more often than fresh milk itself. This was quiet biological engineering. Dairy allowed Vikings to convert grass, rain, and sunlight into human survival. It bridged seasons, softened hunger, and anchored rural life. In years when crops failed or fishing faltered, fermented dairy remained dependable. In the Viking Age, fermentation was not cuisine, it was knowledge, and that knowledge kept entire communities alive. Vegetables were never abundant in the Viking world, but they mattered more than people realized. In a landscape shaped by cold, poor soils, and short growing seasons, grain dominated the table. Meat and fish supplied strength, but without plants, something quieter began to fail. The body weakened slowly. Wounds healed poorly. Illness lingered. Survival required more than calories. Where conditions allowed, Vikings grew peas and beans, humble crops that enriched stews and added plant protein to an otherwise heavy diet. But much of their greenery came not from fields, but from knowledge, from knowing what could be gathered beyond the farmstead. Wild sorrel, nettles, onions, and other greens were harvested seasonally, especially after long winters of grain and preserved food. These plants were not eaten for pleasure. Many were bitter. Some were irritating or mildly toxic when raw. They had to be boiled, often repeatedly, to make them safe. The result was rarely appetizing, but it worked. These greens supplied vitamins absent from barley and dried meat. They prevented slow, invisible diseases that could cripple a household long before starvation set in. A pot of boiled nettles might not lift spirits, but it could save lives. In a Viking meal, color mattered. Most food was brown, gray, or pale. When green appeared, it signaled renewal, spring, recovery, the return of strength. To modern Americans, vegetables are expected. To the Vikings, they were intermittent and vital. In a world where survival balanced on the edge of deficiency, green meant one thing above all else: life was returning. If the Vikings had anything resembling a national dish, it was not a specific recipe. It was a method. Anything that could be boiled belonged in the pot. Stews formed the backbone of everyday eating across the Viking world. Grain, meat scraps, dried fish, bones, herbs, and forage plants all found their way into a single iron cauldron hanging over the hearth. The ingredients changed constantly. The principle never did. Cooking transformed what was hard, bitter, or nearly inedible into something sustaining. Boiling did more than soften food. It pulled nutrients from bones and fibers, extracted fat, and blended flavors into something greater than the sum of its parts. Tough meat became chewable. Old bread dissolved. Dried fish came back to life. What could not be eaten alone became edible together. A single pot could feed an entire household or a ship's crew. It conserved fuel in a world where firewood mattered. It stretched limited supplies through long winters and unpredictable journeys. No one ate alone. Stew was shared, ladled out evenly. reinforcing the idea that survival depended on the group. For the poor, stew erased hierarchy. For sailors, it created routine and chaos. For families, it meant continuity from one harsh day to the next. To modern Americans, soup is comfort food. To the Vikings, it was something more essential. Stew was not cuisine. It was cooperation made edible. And in a world where no one survived alone, that made it the great equalizer. In the Viking world, wealth was not measured in silver alone. It was measured in fat. Animal fat, rendered into lard or tallow, was the most concentrated source of energy available to a pre-industrial society. In a land of cold winds, short days, and relentless labor, fat meant endurance. A spoonful added to porridge, bread, or stew could double the calories of a meal without increasing its size. It turned survival food into fuel capable of carrying a body through freezing nights and exhausting work. Fat was gathered carefully and never wasted. After slaughter, it was slowly rendered in cauldrons, purified, and stored in containers where it could last for months. These reserves determined whether a household could outlast winter. Grain might fill the stomach, but fat kept the body warm and strong. Its value went far beyond the table. Fat fueled lamps that pushed back winter darkness. It waterproofed boots and cloaks. Mixed with ash, it became soap. Blended with herbs, it became medicine. Combined with dried meat, it preserved food for long journeys. One resource sustained nearly every aspect of daily life. In lean years, fat became power. It was shared, traded, guarded, and remembered. Children learned early where it came from and why it mattered. When supplies ran low, it was rationed with care and tension. Calories were not counted. They were negotiated, sometimes defended. In the Viking world, animal fat was not just food. It was security, light, warmth, and survival stored in its purest form. In the Viking world, water was unpredictable. Ale was not. Streams could be fouled, wells could freeze, stored water could turn stagnant and dangerous. Fermentation offered a solution that was both practical and profound. Beer and ale became the safest, most reliable liquids in everyday life. By modern standards, Viking beer was weak in alcohol but strong in calories. Brewed from barley and flavored with local herbs, it retained nutrients from the grain while undergoing fermentation that made it safer to drink than untreated water. It hydrated, it energized, and it lasted. Ale was consumed daily by farmers, sailors, craftsmen, and even children. It fueled labor, softened hunger, and helped bodies endure long hours of work in cold conditions. In a world where food was often scarce and exhausting to digest, liquid calories mattered. But ale did more than sustain the body. It held society together. Drinking was communal. Shared vessels passed from hand to hand. Agreements were made, disputes eased, and loyalty reinforced over ale. It marked rituals, celebrations, and the rhythms of seasonal life. To drink together was to belong. Alcohol, in this context, was not excess. It was structure. Ale replaced unsafe water, preserved grain in drinkable form, and created spaces of connection in an otherwise harsh existence. It was agriculture, chemistry, nutrition, and culture combined. In the Viking Age, civilization did not flow from stone halls or written laws alone. It flowed from shared cups filled with liquid calories that made survival and society itself possible. Viking food was never about pleasure. It was about endurance. Every dish you have just encountered, every porridge, every strip of dried fish, every ladle of stew was shaped by the same relentless question: how do we survive one more winter, one more crossing, one more year in a world that offers no guarantees? This was food stripped of romance. It did not exist to impress, to indulge, or to comfort. It existed to work, to keep bodies moving through cold and exhaustion, to carry communities across oceans and through darkness. Viking cuisine was not a celebration of abundance. It was a system built for failure, designed to function when harvests collapsed, when storms cut off supply, and when hunger pressed close. In an age of supermarkets and endless choice, it is easy to forget how fragile civilization really is. We often imagine that history is driven by weapons, leaders, and battles. But behind every expansion, every settlement, every surviving society, there is something quieter at work: systems that deliver calories when nothing else can. The Vikings did not conquer the North Atlantic with swords alone. They conquered it with porridge that endured cold, with dried fish that crossed oceans, with fat that stored energy, with fire that preserved life. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. Civilizations are not sustained by glory, but by what keeps people alive when glory disappears. If you're drawn to the hidden systems that allowed ancient people to survive food, shelter, engineering, and life at the edge of human endurance, this series was made for you. The past still speaks, and it still has something important to teach us.